Welcome to Your College Bound Kid,
a podcast for parents, college counselors, students, and anyone who wants a weekly deep dive into the world of college admissions.
Hi, I'm Susan, and I'm a college counselor and have read applications for a small liberal arts college and 2 research universities. My twins are recent college graduates.
I'm Lisa, and I'm a clinical psychologist and college counselor. I have a daughter in college, a daughter in high school, and a son in middle school. After 30 years in Chicago, we recently moved to North Carolina.
My name is Mark. I'm a college coach in Atlanta and the parent of 2 daughters. Karis, a graduate of Davidson College, and she is the founder of the Spanish tutoring company, SpanishHelpToday.com. And Joy is a wellness coach at the Keenan Flagler Business School at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. And I'm so blessed to be able to work alongside both my beautiful daughters at School Match for You, a college counseling firm that I founded in 2010. This week in the news, Susan and I will answer a question from a listener who wants advice about architecture programs for an architectural student. And we'll have a brand new interview with my colleague, Jennifer Mandel. And it's an interesting interview because we bounce around and cover 4 distinct topics over 4 weeks. I think you're going to like it. On this week's episode, we'll be talking about the importance of clubs and how the clubs that you select as a student can really catapult you into some really good career opportunities. And then we'll have part 3 of my interview with Dr. Bob McMahan, the president of Kettering University. And what are we talking about? Kettering University.
And now it's time for a question from one of our listeners.
All right, Susan, we've got a question from an anonymous listener about architecture. I'm going to play it and get your thoughts.
Hi, team. Thank you so much for your informative podcast. I have a high schooler who is interested in majoring in architecture, and we, as a family, don't know a ton about that. So would love to hear any advice you can give on what we can be doing now in the high school years to prepare for that and how to evaluate undergraduate programs and pretty much anything that you can share about architecture major and architecture schools. Thank you so much.
Where do you want to start out with this one?
Well, this is exciting. I was just saying to Mark before we played it that I have working with a student this year who is thinking about, architecture, architectural design, interior design, civil engineering, architectural engineering, and it opened my eyes again to the enormous number of choices that a high school senior has when they're thinking about studying architecture in college. And it used to be very straightforward that there were basically 2 choices. You could do a professional degree in 5 years and be ready to sit for your license and off you go in your profession, or you could do a 4-year degree, which then would require you doing apprenticeship hours and a master's degree after your bachelor's degree. And some colleges offered both, some offered one or the other, but that was about it. So as I've educated myself about this, I realized that there are a lot of considerations now other than just those 2 straightforward options. And so it's really exciting to look at. And, it depends a little bit on where a student is at in high school in terms of their coursework, their hands-on experience, their background as an artist or a designer. So kids are in a lot of different places in regards. There are some that are like, what? Oh, I haven't done any of that. I just like the idea, but they've never sat down at a drafting table. They've never done design thinking in terms of, kind of space, which is fine. They're starting afresh. And then I've worked with students who have actually been in an architecture track in high school. Some high schools have engineering tracks, some have nursing, some have architecture. They're these kind of professional high schools that allow kids, albeit prematurely, to end up, with a pretty defined major in high school, and hopefully not at the expense of their foundational college prep studies. But it's fascinating, what's out there. And, I had a student last year, I worked with a student who had taken 1 or 2 architecture full credit classes every year in high school. And they really knew what they were talking about by the time, they became a college applicant, and they knew what to look for. And then, now working with a student who this summer is taking his first exposure to architecture classes. So actually, that's exactly my first word of advice to our mom and her progeny is, as a rising junior or a rising senior, the student should be involved in some kind of summer program that will give a broad overview and exposure to architecture and all the different fascinating, wonderful options. And there are so many of these programs. If you do a web search, from Columbia to
RISD's got a really good one, Susan.
RISD,
Yeah, Rhode Island School Design, they've got a really
Craigie
good one.
Mellon. I was amazed how many there were. The student I'm working with is doing one he lives in New York City, and he's doing one at it's a professional school of architecture and design in New York. And he's taking 3 short architecture courses there. And he has signed up also for a portfolio development course, which leads me to say, not all architecture programs, when you apply from high school, require a portfolio. Quite a few don't. So for a student who is just starting to figure this out and is intimidated by the idea of having a portfolio, first of all, if one is required, it often is general art, that it's not going to be mechanical drawing. It could be if that's what you do, but I was a little surprised when I started looking at portfolio requirements this year that a lot of them are clearly getting at the students' experience and talent in design, rather than technical work. Because once they're in their architecture program, they're going to be technically educated up one side and down the other, right? Mm-hmm. So, in a way, don't be intimidated whenever your student starts expressing an interest. Don't say, oh, you're too late. You can't do it. Just get some experience. Now, some students are well trained in art, studio art, drawing, painting, sculpture, and some of them start turning toward architectural design. So the next thing I think for a parent to do is to realize, well, what are the different college degrees that are offered? So an important resource is the National Architecture Accreditation Board. Mark, I'm a fan of referring families to the professional association that guides colleges in degree requirements and all sorts of things. And whether it's physical therapy or business or architecture, there is a national board that accredits the college programs. And in the education tab of their website, we'll have great resources. So, for example, I looked up the NAAB education section, and they list all 117 accredited degree granting architecture programs in the country. Now,
is that just for the B Arch degree, or is it also the BABS in architecture?
No, it's only the professional degrees. So we'll talk about that in just a second, what that means. But it's the B Arch, Bachelor of Architecture, and the Masters of Architecture. Mm-hmm. So the B Architecture is the undergraduate professional degree that I mentioned earlier, in that it's a very scripted curriculum. It is not a liberal. It has a little bit of liberal arts in it, but not a whole lot. You really have to hit the ground running with your art. You want to hit the ground running with your architecture. And in fact, we had a colleague at the school where we both worked, Mark, who was in a 5-year BARC program when he was in university, and actually got out of it as a 4th-year student so he could graduate, got out of the professional program, and went and did something different for graduate school. So, you learn pretty quickly in these BARC programs, which are very competitive to get into because they are high resource programs on the college side. So they're pretty limited in enrollment. So that's the 5-year Bachelor of Architecture. You are eligible because of the number of apprenticeship hours in those 5-year programs, the co-ops, if you will. You're able to sit for your license pretty quickly after you finish that degree and be hired as an architect. So the National Association or the National Architecture Accrediting Board lists those. When they list a master's, an M.Arch, the master's in architecture, a lot of those universities have undergraduate architecture and or design programs, but they do not extend to the license, right? Because in 4 years, they do not have the experiential hours or all the specific preparation for the license, the national license exam. But so any college that has an M.Arch, Masters of Architecture, probably has an undergraduate degree offered that looks like either a BA in architecture, sometimes a BS, sometimes a BFA. So again, there are a couple ways to look at that. And this, I find, is a very appropriate pathway for a lot of students. You figure if the Bachelor of Architecture is 5 years anyway, they can do a Bachelor of Architecture, a BA or a BS in 4 years, really figure out what it is they want to do with that. And then they do their masters. Now, the masters are usually 2 years because 1 year of coursework and then the equivalent of a year of apprenticeship in order to sit for the license. But this is the employment model that is preferred now. And I was interested in finding this out, that a lot of 5-year B architecture programs actually are being changed. And some of the ones that I always knew of when I looked at the websites have gone to this, get your BA in architecture or your BS and then your master's. So the college list on that website of the NAAB is still very useful because you'll be able to see who has the 5-year BARC program, but then also who's got the master's program. And you can go to those websites and then see what the BA or the BS look like. The BA and the BS are also easier to get into than the Bachelor of Architecture. They don't assume necessarily that there's as much of experience on the high school level, and a lot of them don't require portfolios. Some do, some don't. There's no predicting. You've really got to, look closely into that. So that said, those are some fundamental choices. And then, students who lean toward the fine arts, but who are keenly interested in designing for physical spaces, right? That it used to be, interior design. Well, that doesn't really, we think of interior design as being, the furniture that a new office, brings in. But a BFA in architecture is really the study of interior and exterior space from a building perspective. So there are BFA architects in most architecture companies, and they play a certain role. They tend to be the design thinkers from the artistic side, and not just like a structural side. Mm-hmm. So the real structural architects are the architectural engineers. So that degree is called a BAE, and it's a field that applies engineering principles to the design and construction of buildings and their systems, spatial, cultural, and material forces that shape buildings and built environment. So for a student who has that STEM, is bringing that STEM focus to everything, even to their design interests, might want to look at BAE, Bachelor of Architectural Engineering. Now, the last one, believe it or not, there's yet another one, is what I call the liberal arts approach. Now, you might say, well, isn't the BA in architecture a liberal arts approach? Well, yeah, but it's still, architecture is the study of built environments or landscape or interior, right? Some liberal arts colleges offer architectural design as one of their liberal arts majors, very much in the context of the rest of the liberal arts curriculum. So they're not in a separate school or undergraduate area of study. It's really integrated into the liberal arts. And it might attract artists who are looking not at studio art so much, fine arts, as much as art in the built world. And I think this is absolutely fascinating because not all kids are ready for a bachelor's degree in architecture. It's very different. They have to make sure they know what they're getting into. But, a couple of schools like Connecticut College, thank you, Andy Strickler, and Hobart William Smith College in New York State are two schools that for, many, many years have had an architectural studies program as one of their liberal arts majors. So that can be a great option for kids who are really not ready to commit or apply directly to, a BA, BS, BArch, BFA in architectural. And we've got industrial design as an ancillary major that a lot of kids don't think about, that can be a great field for kids who want to combine computer science and design and architecture.
Susan, a lot of times I find students that are interested in architecture initially, eventually end up learning about urban planning and finding that very exciting. And so one thing that I always recommend students try to do is see if you can do some shadowing, if you can do that and getting a sense of what the actual job description is like. Reach out to some local architecture firms or work the network through your parents and who your parents know, and counselors, as well as city planning departments, especially if you're in a metro area. And I would look at curriculum as well. Look at what a degree in urban planning versus the many degrees Susan said, what kind of courses you would take, and get a sense of that. Read those course descriptions.
Yep.
Also, math tends to be something that's important.
And physics.
Yep. Math and physics. Studio art as well. Having some studio art. Comp sci can be important.
Yep, absolutely.
And history too. Art history, architectural history. That's not something you're generally going to be offered that level of specificity, but you could take a Coursera course. In any of this stuff, you could take a course at edX, Coursera, one of the competitors, and get a sense of what it would be like. Geometry. A lot of times people tend to be not terrible at geometry. I'll put it that way. Geometry, calculus, if possible, physics, like you said.
Absolutely. Develop your spatial and your analytical strengths as well as your design and creative strengths.
Yeah. So hopefully we gave you a few tips there that will be helpful. Thank you so much, and send us in more questions, and thank you for being a listener.
And now this week's interview with a special guest.
Friends, in part one of my interview with Jennifer Mandel, Jen gives her backstory as a parent, really of 4 business majors when you consider there's a 4th student that all but practical purposes, they lived with them during the college search. Also her as an educator and her as a social worker. We introduce our topic for the day, the opportunity clubs present for college students to set you up for career success. Jen explains all the benefits of college clubs. She talks about her own kids' experience with clubs. She gives some excellent tips for what to do to get through the competitive process of joining some of the most selective clubs. Listen and enjoy. Friends, I'm here with Jennifer Mandel from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Hi, Jen.
Hi, Mark.
So, friends, I'm going to let Jen introduce herself in a second, but I'm going to give you just a little bit of background. So, Jen works with me at School Match for You, and she has now for almost 2 years. But she is a podcast listener just like you, never has missed an episode going back to 2018. And probably about 6 months or so ago, she said a couple things that were really profound. And I'm like, I want our podcast listeners to hear that. I just kind of filed it away mentally. And then that happened again about 90 days, maybe more like 30, I don't know, a month and a half ago. I'm bad with time. She did that again on a couple things. And I said, all right, that's it. Time for you to come on the podcast. So this is going to be a little different kind of interview where we're going to like jump around and cover 4 different things that she said that I thought would be of value to you. But having said that, Jen, introduce yourself. Let our listeners know your various backgrounds and what you're doing now, and so they can understand the context from which you're going to speak today.
Hi, thanks for the setup. Just to acknowledge, thank you for calling my comments profound. Mark knows that
It's true.
I struggle with the word profound. Just to give a little bit of background, I am a parent of 3 boys. One just graduated from college. All 3 of my boys were business majors, and my oldest is graduated from college. He is now doing sales, and he is living away from home. He is successfully launched and renting his own apartment and doing sales. My middle child is at Wisconsin. He's in their business school there and studying corporate finance. And my youngest is a sophomore at TCU. He worked with Mark in the college counseling process, and he is studying business as well. And we'll talk about him a little bit later.
And I get to go to lunch with him. I get to go to dinner with him on April 24th when I'm visiting TCU, which I'm really excited about.
Awesome. I also have one other child that is not my biological, but he may come up later. My husband and I have done a fair amount of hosting of foreign exchange students and Amity interns and au pairs in our house. And we did have an exchange student that has really stuck with us through the years. And he does live here now due to violence in his own country. He doesn't live with us. He's a grown adult now. But he finished college here in America, and he's a business major, and he lives here in the Milwaukee area. So he is somebody else that I probably will reference later. So he's my boy.
So Jen, that was all great. And we always want to know about family. So I'm really glad you talked about all your family members. But I also want our listeners to know about your social work and your education background. So talk about that too as well.
So I also am an educator. I've been an educator for about many years, since 2001. I've worked in the city of Milwaukee, and I have a background. I started off doing school social work, working with students of all ages, basically age 3 through a little bit older than 18. And in the scope of doing school social work, I started becoming more interested in school administration. So now I'm an assistant principal, working with all different ages of students. So I've been able to do that as well. So I've had the advantage of working with students and being a parent.
So, and what would you say, how would you describe this different school districts that you've worked in?
The district that I work in does tend to, it's in the city of Milwaukee, so it does have a wide variety of students. It's different than a lot of the schools that you describe on the podcast. When I'm listening to the podcast, I can relate to, a lot of the school districts that you talk about. But it isn't really the image of the students that I service. I would say it's not, the students that I service are not necessarily coming from well-resourced families. A lot of them would be the first generation students. There are definitely a lot of students that I service that have multiple languages, or, maybe their families don't speak English, or they have, many hardships going on at home. Some, not all, have hardships at home, that getting through school and getting to the finish line of high school graduation can be an extra challenge that a lot of our listeners may not have as much experience with. So when I hear some of the stories of when, the well-resourced schools that you may be referencing once in a while, it flies in the face of some of the families that I service. It's kind of the other end of the continuum. And I have the luxury of being able to see the power that my students have to get to that end line, and seeing the resilience that they have, and seeing the strengths that they can bring to colleges and communities, because they are amazing. And I think oftentimes people don't see that, or they may have stereotypes or lack of knowledge, or just really not having the ability to know really what they bring to the table in the college setting.
But your own school district is where your kids went is, what would you say?
The district where my own children are, it's a pretty well-resourced district. It's a public school district. It's well-resourced. Most of the kids there go on to college. They have pretty good test scores. It's pretty well-resourced for the Wisconsin area. It's definitely one of the better ones in the state.
So that's great. And I wanted you to sort of hear Jen's background. Part of her background was why I wanted to hire her, because I think that that's a very important background, that she brings social work, working in different school contexts, as well as the fact that all her boys, all of them are business majors. Her husband's in that realm as well. So that's sort of a great background. And I'm someone who believes in transferable skills. When you have someone who's just a complete sponge for knowledge, and then they, work with I don't know, Jen, you've met with well over 100 families. You can grow to. There's different paths to this whole process. And so I want to transition to our very first topic, and it's conversations that I've been having with Jen for a while, and where we've been talking about the fact that we haven't talked that much on the podcast about how important the clubs are that your student gets involved in, especially if they're interested in going into some competitive job markets in that. So when she said that, I'm like, you're absolutely right. I started thinking about a lot of families I've worked with, and how important it was that they got into certain clubs, and how the clubs that they got into led them to certain. I'm thinking of a student I worked with at the University of Michigan, and another student at the University of Georgia, and just other students are flashing in my mind about how important the clubs were that they got involved with, and how that led them to their job opportunities. So this is something that Jen feels very strongly about. Jen, so just share what you want to share about this, because you're absolutely right. It isn't something we've talked a lot about on the podcast. So share what's on your mind on this topic.
I can mainly speak from the perspective of being a parent, walking my own children through their college process. And like I said earlier, they are all business majors. They all went to different types of schools. As I said, my oldest, he went to Missouri State, so his is probably about 15,000, so mid-size college, and my middle one is at a large school, and then my youngest is at the mid-size TCU. I do think the clubs do play a significant role in where students are going in terms of their experiences, being able to sample out careers, learn about careers, and having that trajectory possibly for internships, letters of reference. What I learned with my youngest at his school at TCU was during the student admit day. When we walked in, this was his senior year in high school, we walked in and they showcased some of their clubs in the business department. And I remember him being really impressed with some of the clubs. And they made it very clear as to, they had students get up and they spoke about the mentorship that they received in the business world through the clubs. Honestly, I don't remember exactly the fine details of them, but I do remember them talking and saying, had it not been for this club, I would have never had this experience in the financial world. And by the way, most people don't have this experience in college. Like, I am lucky to have had this experience, and it's only because of this club. And that was one of a handful of clubs that they offered. These clubs were, now this is just one school, but they said, these are the clubs that you want to join when you're here. So I remember that being a big draw for my son. He took down notes of the clubs that he wanted to join there, and started. It became apparent at that point that those clubs were important to him, and were important for the job trajectory. The clubs allowed him to see the opportunities that were there. So his freshman year, he started researching the different clubs that were open to him within the business department. And most of the students who were interested in clubs knew the most competitive clubs. And they were competitive. It was definitely hard to get into. And I remember you and Dave talking about this maybe a year or two ago, about how competitive these clubs have gotten on campuses, and relating to that conversation you and Dave had.
Yeah, we did it in the news, and he was talking about it's harder to get into some clubs at Yale than it is to get into Yale.
Right. And I could relate to this because it applied to not just my youngest college, but also I had talked about this at Wisconsin at their business school as well. They're extremely competitive to get into. From the business ones, if you want to get into these ones. And the reason why is because they offer so many opportunities. You can get in. If you can get in, they offer a lot of opportunities to meet with mentors. And the mentors oftentimes are in the careers of, if it's in the consulting world, in the investment banking world, in the real estate world, or anything else, maybe in the finance world. Possibly it's in the sales world, because that's important. If it's in entrepreneurial world, depends on what avenue your child wants to go in within business. But those clubs offer those mentors that have their feet in the real world, and their mentorship can give a lot of help. They can give immense help. It's not just giving a little bit of guidance. I'll talk about that, and remind me to look back on that. So you can get mentorship, you can get alumni help, you can have professors that are there to, sometimes I know at my son's club that he's in right now, they have a course. So he's taking a course for credit that aligns with the club. They do, field trips is the wrong word, but they do visits out of the city, and they go to different cities. Maybe it's to Wall Street, maybe it's to other cities where you're going to look at investment banks. So you're now traveling with this class and club once you make the club. So it brings in a lot of different experiences that gives you the connections with mentors, alumni, and then you get that experiential learning, so that you can basically have those opportunities to learn, is this something I really want to do? What's really involved in the job? How hard is the job? What is the pay like? Where are the jobs? How competitive is it in different regions? How does Wall Street compare to Chicago? What are the advantages and disadvantages? What is the application timeline? What do I need to do to prepare for the application? I mean, these are really important things. And some of the things you want to do when you're looking at the clubs is figuring out which clubs you want to join. How do you prepare for those clubs? I would say, looking at who's in those clubs, talking to them ahead of time. Sometimes, depending on the people in the clubs, maybe doing coffee chats with them, meeting them ahead of time online and talking to them, perhaps looking at their LinkedIn profile and seeing what they have, what their experience is, depending on the age of the club members. Some of them may not have LinkedIn yet, but a lot of our students do. Finding out who's in there, what the club brings, And kind of like we've talked about before with colleges, when you're going through the college application, look at the mission and vision. You want to know, what is this club targeted for, so that when you're interviewing for that club, you are targeting that. What is the vision of the club? Why am I here? What is the point? And being able to interview well for that. But hopefully before you interview for it, you've already gone through looking to see who's in there. You've met with members of the club. You know why it's there. You know why it's important to you. Don't just go to it because it just feels like it's competitive and, it seems like the right thing to do. You want to have it resonate with you. For example, I pointed my kids out a few times to the idea of real estate. But two of my sons, I said, real estate's something that is really popular. Both my kids were like, nah, I'm not interested. Okay, fine. At least I gave them that opportunity to look into it. They looked into it and both of them said no. That's important. You want to find something that resonates with you.
So this conversation with clubs is can be very, very important, especially for certain professions. I'm thinking of a student I worked with who really had wanted to go to Wall Street and also had wanted to go to the University of Michigan and ended up getting into Michigan LSA, but did not get into the Ross Business School. And I did a follow-up session with her 2 years actually after she had started at Michigan. And I just wanted to see how it was going. And it was going extremely well for her. And one thing she was so happy about is she's now set up to have a path toward a Wall Street job because she got into the right clubs, even that she never got into the Ross Business School. And so just by getting into the right clubs and the mentoring and the training, and then that network is so important. And then because all of these clubs are really selective, just getting into them coupled with the mentoring and all that is just a really powerful thing on your resume that can get you into the interview process. And so, and this is a conversation that comes up with me a lot for students looking at Michigan. They want business. They would like to get into the Ross School, but it's incredibly hard to get into. It's one of the hardest schools to get into. And then they wonder, well, if I don't get into Ross, can I not go into business? And so I share that story. For somebody listening here to this, Jen, what would be some tips you would give them to help them to stand out to get into these clubs? And before you say that, I'll share another story. I was visiting UC Berkeley in September, and I was just talking with students. And I had a very lengthy conversation for about 25 minutes with a student and her boyfriend. And she made the point. She said, everything is so tough here. It's like tough to get into classes. And then she said, it's tough to get into clubs. And then I'm sure it was a bit of exaggeration, but she's like, I feel like even something like the baking club, it's like 4 interviews and you have to dress up to go through the process. So this is a common thing at a lot of schools where there's a competitive club process. What do you want to say, Jen? What makes somebody stand out? What are the things that you feel?
Yeah. So I think the first thing you have to do is be at the right school. You have to be at the right college that fits you right. Mark, you and I have talked about my middle in the business school at Madison, and he's thriving. He's doing great. But I often say I would shrivel up and die at such a big school. That it's a big school, and the clubs there are very competitive, and you're dealing with a much larger class there. So you're dealing with more students, more competitiveness, and you use the term sharp elbows. You have to have sharp elbows to get into those clubs. And if you want to be in these clubs, you just have to be at the right school to begin with, right? So when in your college search, make sure when you're looking that you're looking for the school that really is that right fit and not all about the prestige. You do want to find the one that has some good job opportunities and all that, but you have to find the fit where you're going to be comfortable to get into the club and you don't have any imposter syndrome and you feel like you really are in a campus that supports you and you are part of that unit. So that would be my first thing. The other thing is if you're in high school, I say use those opportunities for those clubs when you're in high school. take your experiences. I can only speak for my own children. They did, they were in sports and did some other things in high school, but they worked. So a lot of times they used their course experiences and their work experience, whether they're working at a bank or working at the grocery store, or working wherever their jobs were, working at, doing catting or whatever it was, using those work experiences to line up their applications, because a lot of times these clubs start freshman year. So you want to be able to have some experiences that you're using on those applications. Oftentimes you may find those things may overlap with your essay questions that you use to get into college. So some of them you may find overlap. But you want to look at your experiences and kind of go over what makes you different than the next person. What are your skills that you're bringing to that business club or whatever club it is that you're applying? Is it work experience, leadership experience? So you want to kind of tally out what it is that's different about you and why that would be beneficial to the club. But again, you want to line that up to that mission and vision. You have to stay focused on where that is. And then, like I said earlier, interview people who are in there, find out what they're doing, make sure it's of interest to you. Make sure that when you're interviewing and that if you have to write any essay questions for the club, make sure that the people that you're interviewing listen to what they're saying so that when you're writing those essay questions, it aligns to what the club really is about.
That's great. Friends, this concludes part 1 of my interview with Jen Mandel. Hope you'll join us next week for part 2.
And now it's time for our College Spotlight of the Week.
Friends, I did a fascinating 2-hour interview with the president of Kettering University, Dr. Bob McMahan. And we're spreading it out over 5 weeks, about 25 minutes each week. And we're up to part 3. So in part 3, Bob talks about what the unique role they have created for the Chief Student Experience Officer. And he explains why they have a Chief Student Experience Officer instead of a Dean of Student Life. Bob talks about what they can do and cannot do at Kettering when it comes to things like fraternities, sororities, study abroad, clubs, and sports. Bob talks about the unique program they have with Germany that they've had for over 30 years. Bob talks about the gender ratio at Kettering. Bob tells us what percentage of students go to work full-time for the same employer that was their co-op employer. Bob talks about the entrepreneurship culture that exists at Kettering. And we come back to the gender imbalance question, and Bob explains why there is a gender imbalance at all engineering-oriented schools. Listen and enjoy. Now, do your employers give like written feedback about the performance of the students? And is there anything that you at Kettering do with that feedback, incorporate it into your advising or guidance or, instruction as you get various levels of feedback?
Yes. In
Talk to us
fact,
about
they
that.
do.
Mm-hmm.
Every term, at the conclusion of every co-op term, there's a report that the co-op employers are kind of a feedback that the co-op employers give us, and it goes into our academic and cooperative advising process. We have a different model for student life here that many institutions have. If you go to most institutions, they'll have a dean of student affairs or a dean of student life, and they'll have a set of functions. We have what we call here. We have a chief student experience officer rather than a dean of student life, and that person is charged with integrating all the aspects of the university experience from the student's perspective, and that includes incorporating the feedback that we get from our cooperative employers into the academics of the student and the student's experience here on campus. So if we have a student that's having a difficulty in their cooperative, in their position, for example, we know that is going to have some kind of expression in their academic performance. And so we can work proactively to use that information and inform how we approach the student with respect to their academics as part of that process. So yes, that feedback is very important. But there's another form of feedback that's as equally as important if you think about this. I always say we're the only university in the United States whose relevance gets evaluated every 12 weeks. Because when a group of students comes back from working with some of the world's most sophisticated technology companies and some of the highest tech areas, when they come back, they tell us what we need to be doing differently to be responsive to what's happening in those industries. And that feedback occurs on multiple levels. I've been in classrooms here where the faculty, where the professor that's leading the class will say, be teaching some, esoteric engineering topic, and they'll look out to the classroom and they'll say, Jane, I know you're working with this company in their high-speed wind tunnel division. This would be a relevant equation for you. How do you guys use this in your? And then Jane will say, well, we don't do this quite. This is not useful to us. We use this approximation and we use this formulation of this because that is more appropriate to what we're doing. So there's that dialogue that occurs in the classroom in ways that I don't think occurs anywhere else.
So I can absolutely see the appeal of this. There's just no question about it on so many levels. But I can also see some people being concerned because they had certain traditional things in mind when they think of college.
Yes.
So sports is one, fraternity, sorority, study abroad, clubs. What are the things that you're able to do and not able to do with students coming like back and forth every 12 weeks? What are the things that maybe they should be aware of that you're not going to get X over here? You've already said one, football. You're already 1,500. Yep. A lot of schools with 1,500 don't have football. But then when you're coming and going every 12 weeks, it's pretty understandable why you wouldn't have that. Are you able to do anything in the way of varsity sports, or does it all have to be intramural? I'm sure you have some type of recreational, component to things. Is it just intramural and club, or can you do varsity with that model?
One of the things that's important to note is that these cohort, the sections, the A and B sections, they move together as cohorts. So when they come back to campus, they kind of pick up where they left off. Mm-hmm. And there is we don't do division varsity sports, but we have one of the most robust intramural programs in the country. And we have a club here for everything. I mean, it is incredible the number of student associations and clubs that we have, and we foster that because we want that kind of. We have a very active and robust Greek life community here. We have, I think, the national average for student participation in Greek organizations is something like 17-20%. Ours is more like 45%. And Greek life here takes a added dimension of not just being social, but it's also a support system for students. So these are collaboratives. Because after all, these students go away for half the time they are in organizations where we are working together to solve something. And then and then traditional higher education is, well, I'm doing this by myself, right? But they don't engage their education in this way here. They engage their education in that same way. We're doing this together, and we're moving through this process together. So there's an enormous number of activities. There's a lot of richness in what in the students and student life and what they can participate in. But no, we don't have division in sports.
Study abroad. Are you able to do study abroad? I'm sure you probably have international co-ops, I would think.
Yes, we have international co-ops, and we have a very robust study abroad program. We have one in particular. We have with a large number of universities across the globe, everywhere from Asia to Europe and South America. But the largest single program we have, I think, is a program that we have a cooperative arrangement with all of the universities in southern Germany. And so we send typically about 100 students a year to southern Germany to study, and they send 100 students to us every year. And that program has been going on in that kind of symmetric way for over 30 years. And it has been incredibly successful. And many of the students who participated in it say it's one of their highlight experiences as a student here was being able to go to Central Europe and study engineering at one of the technical schools in Germany and learn how they are approaching these problems, as well as get the larger experience of exploring the continent.
Now, I heard you say fraternities. I never heard sororities. What's the gender
Yes.
breakdown at the school?
We do have sororities as well as fraternities. We look like most engineering colleges across the country, which means we're about a quarter female.
Do most of the students co-op at the same place they've co-opted before? What percentage go back to a place they did before versus, a different location?
About half, roughly half, stay with the same co-op throughout their careers here. There's no requirement that they do. They do because the fit is excellent and it's satisfying their educational outcomes. The other half range. Some are change once because they've had a change of heart. I had one student, for example, I know, started off in a product engineering role, found out that they didn't like that too much. That was a co-op was a great. They were very accommodating of the student. They were giving them a great experience, but they found out that that's not what they wanted to do professionally. They really do more research engineering. So the student went from that to a research engineering position at a national laboratory. And that's an example of a student that switches. And other students are very entrepreneurial. Their goal is to start a company. And we have a large cohort of entrepreneurial students here. We have a very active entrepreneurship society, et cetera. Their goal is to sample a number of companies to understand how different organizations work, kind of corporate cultures, especially smaller companies, and how they work. And so they might have 2 or 3 co-op placements over the course, or more in some cases, over the course of their education. But it's deliberate. In their case, they want to switch and see and sample different organizations.
Bob, I want to come back to the 25% female. So there's some schools that have similar numbers, and they say it is what it is. There's just more of a demand amongst guys. Then I can think of places like WPI or Harvey Mudd that have made it a massive institutional priority to try to, change those numbers. Some of them have had set goals to try to get to 50-50 or at least get to 60-40 by gender. Where does Kettering come down when it comes to sort of being satisfied with the 75-25 ratio on gender?
Well, we're not satisfied, of course. We want to equalize that. But there's been a lot of work done in this area, especially around engineering programs, and it turns out that a lot of the results of that research point to the fact that it is as much a function of the program mix as anything else, because different programs attract the different genders in different proportions. And I know there was an effort at MIT a number of years ago to increase the number of women in some of their core engineering programs. And they did a lot of work. They spent a lot of money, and they didn't move the needle at all. But what they did find was that the way to change that was to change the program mix, and you see that at some institutions. And we're working very hard to change those numbers, although the balance here.
Can you elaborate on that, change the program mix? What exactly are you referring to when you say change the program mix?
What degree programs we offer.
I see. Because women are more drawn to certain ones than others, and if you and which are some of the ones that you find are more appealing? Does it have to be outside of the engineering world, or can you stay within engineering and still have that appeal? Mm-hmm.
Well, we're a STEM institution, so
Sure.
it tends to, that's
Sure.
our focus. But there tends to be, and this is as accurate as generalizations are, right?
Sure.
which is to say you can always point to multiple exceptions. But there's a tendency towards women being more attracted to disciplines in engineering that have a human component to them, things that touch, things like biomedical engineering, chemical engineering, etc. And there is a tendency towards men being more, and this is what MIT found in their study as well, men more towards kind of the making things orientation. Now
Tinkering.
I can tinkering. Now I can just as easily point to a young woman who,
Exceptions.
yeah, a young woman who just recently graduated. She's head of suspension design for Daimler, and her passion was designing advanced suspension systems for off-road vehicles, right? So these are not by any
Sure.
means hard and fast rules, but I would say there's a tendency towards those things. So we also work to how do we balance the curriculum offerings to kind of play in both spaces, and that's an ongoing effort for us. And those numbers have been increasing over time. But like I said earlier, and that is not an atypical ratio for engineering colleges across the country.
No, I was, if you go on Penn State's website, they have all of their, under the engineering section, they have a breakdown of each discipline and what the male female breakdown is. And, some of them are like 18%, and depending on, which ones we're talking
Yeah,
about. And most of them are under 30.
yeah.
Most are in between 18 and 29. So what percentage of your graduates end up taking a full-time job with one of your co-op partners?
A fair number do. Many of them receive an offer from their co-op partner. And often that offer comes in their junior year. So it's not unusual here to have students in their, going into their senior year already knowing where they're going to be going afterwards. We are very successful in placing our students in some of the top graduate programs in the country. A lot of programs. There was an article in Forbes a few years ago where they interviewed the dean of the Harvard Business School, the dean of admissions at Harvard Business School, and said, how do you get into Harvard Business School? And one of the things that she said at the time was, well, we love Kettering students. And we were actually the only institution that was named in the article other than Harvard itself. There's an understanding at schools like HBS and GSB at Stanford and Sloan and Wharton of what a Kettering student represents. Because after all, many of these elite programs, they require that you have several years of on-the-job experience before they'll even consider you for admission. Well, our students get admitted right after graduation because they already have that experience. They already understand it. And so it's not just about necessarily about getting a job, but can you pursue the next step in your career as you want. And graduate school for many students is one of those possibilities, and we have a very successful placement record there. But like I said earlier, most students receive offers from their co-op employers. Most students receive multiple job offers, in fact, upon graduation, and they have the luxury of the choice of opportunities.
Bob, can you talk a little bit about the academic profile of the students that you admit, and also, what criteria you use to select students on the front end? Like, someone's listening and they're wondering,
Yeah.
my student's got a 3.3 and 1100 on the SATs. Is it like, well, don't bother applying here? People like to have a sense of what a competitive applicant looks like, and also how you evaluate an application and what criteria you use to decide who you admit.
That's a great question, and I'm sure the vice president of enrollment management is going to be listening very carefully to make sure that I capture
Don't mess up.
everything, that I don't mess up here, or she's going to have my head on this. But I will say, I think first and foremost, it's important to say that we recognize that we are an unusual program,
Sure.
and that we're looking for something in students that doesn't necessarily get reflected specifically in a number from a certain test. So we really do take holistic admissions seriously here, and we look at the entirety of the student. Because sometimes you'll get students that are clearly, that because of what they have done and what they have achieved up to that point, they are clearly capable, but that their academic records don't necessarily reflect that. And so we have a process that allows us to take those things into consideration.
So work history or volunteerism, those kinds of things get factored in because they're evidence of somebody plugging in and applying stuff in a real life context, and that's what you guys are all about. So that tends to translate.
That's right. We're a STEM program, so we look for students that have strong math aptitudes and they are typically students that have done well in high school. So our entering class is typically of a GPA around unadjusted, unweighted of in the upper threes, say 3.7, 3.6, 3.7. And for those, we are test optional, but for those who report test scores, we typically see SATs, for example, in the mid 12s on average for the class. Math scores in the 600s.
Yeah, and our listeners know those are not cutoffs, but they're
not cutoffs. That's right.
But they just give you a feel of sort of the typical student, just to give a sense. Any personal qualities that you look for in particular that when you see this, you think, oh, this could be a Kettering student?
We love grit.
Mm-hmm. Resilience,
we love
grit.
Resilience. We love demonstration of that. In fact, that weighs heavily in our evaluation of students in terms of, the holistic. If we see evidence that this is a student that is, because that's, after all, that's, it's not, it's go back to Charles Kettering. One of the things Charles Kettering said, is that it's not failure is not the problem. It's it's how you respond to the failure that defines you, what you do. And so we look for that tenacity, we look for that resilience, and a student that has ample demonstration of that, and maybe not as strong an academic record, weighs heavily on us because we see the makings of someone who is, who has the grit and is capable of excelling in a program. Because the program is rigorous. That we don't have, like I said earlier, the student, when they enter that rotation, we're on quarters effectively, which are essentially compressed semesters. We're on quarters here. And so we are open all year. We don't have a summer holiday. We don't have a mini-mester sometime during the year. We have, our students are either here or they're in their professional placements, and they rotate back and forth. They like it. They like that. So it requires that kind of tenacity and that intensity.
I'm sure you're probably familiar with Paul Tuff's book, How Children Succeed, where,
Yes.
he did copious amounts of research on what correlates with success. And once again, he kept coming back over and over to this grit, resilience, tenacity piece. So I love it when I hear people say that, because I think that the research bears out, and life bears that out, right? You're going to get knocked down sometimes.
Yeah, and
I've have a tough co-op. Do you fold your tent and go home, or do you learn?
I had one vice president for a major company say to me one time. He was talking about one of our student teams. He said, I will take a student with a B average or a C average who's the captain of that team and shows that they can lead that team and build that thing that they are building successfully, I will take a C average student that can do that over an A average student any day of the week and twice on Sunday. He said, because that is part of the winning formula, that tenacity, that ability to because we all fail at things. Failure is one of the great art forms of the world. It's not failure or not to fail. It's what you do. Again, it's what you do when you fail, and building that resilience and building that sense of confidence. Because after all, think of it this way. I would put it this way. We are in such a fast-moving technology environment, right? That you go to school for 4 years. By the time you graduate, half the stuff you've learned in your first 2 years is obsolete. So in terms of the data, the factual knowledge, the laws of physics don't change, but a lot of stuff. And so you say, what is it that we're doing? What are we actually educating students? Because we're educating them for their lifetime. We're not educating them for their first job. So what is it that we're actually doing? What we're actually doing is we're teaching them the habits of mind, the behaviors and the skills to persist, to understand, to deal with complexity, to decompose difficult problems and make them solvable. And most importantly, to understand that in no way, shape, or form can you learn in the first 4 years everything you need to know for your lifetime. So a critical part of what you need to do as a professional is constantly retool yourself, constantly reinvent yourself, constantly create value in what you can contribute. And that means that you have to constantly evolve as a professional. So part of what we are teaching students is not just the immutable laws of physics and this is the statics equation for this structure. We are teaching them how to think, how to be a professional in their discipline, how to retool themselves and recraft themselves as they evolve as a professional. Because as most of us know, most of us are not following at 35 or 45 are not following the path we set at 25. We have reinvented ourselves, and that pliancy, that flexibility, and that grit is an incredibly important part of being successful.
Friends, this concludes part 3 of 5 of my interview with Dr. Bob McMahan, president of Kettering University. We hope you join us next week for part 4. On Monday's episode, I'm going to do the most detailed overview I have done on YCBK on how holistic admissions works. Can't cover everything, but I'll cover some aspects of how decisions are actually made. I've done this in doses here and there before, but not as comprehensively as I'll do on Monday's episode. Then we'll have part 2 of 4 of Linda's excellent interview with Jay Hall, college dean, author, and podcaster in Oklahoma. And they will focus on how to successfully transition from high school to college and how to have a successful first year in college. Friends, I'm going to close with a quote that I've read to you a half dozen times at least if you've been a regular listener of our podcast. But I'll give you a little bit of background. If you were to ask me to pick the one thing from all of my interactions with admission officers and my own experience that I think grinds the gears of admission officers the most, it would be students trying to tell the admission officer what they think the admission officer wants to hear. In other words, it's inauthenticity. So our friends, our regular listeners probably know I'm going to read my favorite quote on authenticity from one of my favorite people in admissions. She's been out of it now for almost 15 years, but I got to spend a little bit of time with her when she was the dean at Stanford. And, I've just always been impressed by her. And I think the book she wrote, even that it's pretty dated now, just called College Admissions, this is as good a book as you'll read on college admissions. By the way, she interacted and interviewed over 200 deans for that book. Anyway, here's the quote. Even more than impressive test scores, or great transcripts, or fantastic essays, colleges are looking for authenticity. Not the appearance of authenticity, not the packaging of authenticity, not the strategy of authenticity, just authenticity. Plain and simple. So why is that? If they detect exaggeration or pretense or packaging, how do they know which parts of the application are real? Robin Mamlet, former Dean of Admissions, Stanford University. See you on Monday, friends. And that's our show. Big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in this week. If you find this podcast helpful, please follow us and you will get every single episode as soon as they are released. If you want to support our podcast, you can click the share button and send it to your friends and acquaintances. You can say positive things about your college-bound kid on your social media feed. And you can help us stay commercial-free and pay our staff by donating on the yourcollegeboundkid.website. You can write a review for us on Apple or Spotify. And if you have a question or a recommendation, just go to speakpipe.com/YCBK, hit the orange button, and speak. We will do our best to get your question in your own voice on an upcoming episode. I am the producer of the podcast, and I live in Metro Atlanta. We have a fantastic team that has over 200 years of admissions and counseling experience. Shout out to our co-hosts, Dr. Lisa Ruff in North Carolina, Susan Tree in Pennsylvania, Vince Garcia in California, Julia Escabel in Massachusetts, Linda Depker in Missouri, Andy Strickler, the Chief Enrollment Officer at Connecticut College, New London, Connecticut, Hillary Dickman, an Admission Officer at Colorado College in Colorado Springs, and our international admissions expert, Kevin Newton in Dallas, Texas. Our sensational sound engineer is Nemanja Motvich. Our amazing music is from Victor Allen Weeks. Marketing designs from Kimberly Bloss. Our reliable webmaster is Stylionis Dimitru. Website updates are done by Joyce Stucker. Our image editor is Vlad Honchar. If you want to have a coaching session with me, just text me at 404-664-4340. If you want to reach someone else on our team, all of our bios with contact info can be found at yourcollegeboundkid.com under the About YCBK tab. If you want to get our free monthly YCBK newsletter, YCBK Plus, it is also under the About YCBK tab. If you want to see our recommended books and websites, they are on our website under the Resources tab. While you're on our website, check out our hundreds of interviews in their entirety. Check out our college spotlights, our blog, and our upcoming events. We think of you as our listening family, and we look forward to meeting with you every single Monday and every single Thursday.